Well, good morning. Morning. It's great to see everyone this morning. I tell you what, winter has come early, hasn't it? It's crazy this morning how cold it is. It almost looked like snow on the ground this morning. There was so much frost, but I guess that might happen this week. But it's good to see everyone this morning. We're going to wrap up our series on how Jesus handled conflict. I hope this series has been helpful to you. I know it's been very helpful to me as I'm kind of just thinking through different things in my own life. Over these last several weeks, we've looked at a lot of different things. We talked about the first week, we talked about grace and how grace fits into conflict. We talked about the mission, right? Sticking to God's mission in our lives when it comes to conflict. Last week, we kind of took a little bit of a different route, maybe than normal, when we talk about conflict, when we talked about strategic anger, right? I had several people this week say, I've never thought of anger being the way that it was shown there. And if you missed that message, I'd really encourage you to check it out. We have it online. So we've learned a lot over the series, but today we're going to wrap it up. Today is going to be the final message of the series. We're going to talk about Jesus' plan on how to handle conflict. And, a few years ago when I was in middle school, that was a few years ago now that I think about it, more than a few years ago. When I was in middle school, let's just say this might come as a surprise to many of you. I tend to be, as a person, my personality, I tend to be a little bit more what they call, I'm not as an extrovert as much. I tend to be a little bit more introverted than extroverted. I mean, I could be extroverted when I need to be, but I'm an introvert. And so when I was in middle school, it was even worse because, it's middle school, right? You talk about one of the most awkward times of our life. Middle school is one of them. And I remember there was a group of kids that I'd hung out with through my elementary school age years. And when I got into middle school, it's funny, even now I see it, we're trying to figure out who they are, who their friendships are, who the groups are that they're connected to. And so these cliques, are starting to form in middle school. And there was a group of boys that I had been friends with in elementary school who I became friends with going into middle school, but they kind of took a different path. They were going in a direction where, they were a little bit bigger than everyone else. They were kind of the sports type guys, and so they tended to pick on people. But I wanted to be their friend so bad, right? I wanted to resolve the conflict because there was a conflict that kind of happened there. They were wanting me to be a part of that. I didn't really want to be a part of that. But yet the pressure was on, and there was this internal conflict that was going on there between us. And it reached a point where they started then picking on me because I wasn't a part of that. So then I'm in this dilemma, right? Okay, do I join in with them and so that I kind of self-preservation, right? Or do I stand up to them and then endure their wrath, right? And so I took the bad route for a time. I decided, I'm going to resolve this conflict by joining in with them. And that went on maybe for a few weeks or so, but then I started to realize this isn't right. This isn't what God wants me to do. And so eventually I was able to get out, and it was tough because I remember even going into high school, those guys continued to give me a hard time because I wouldn't join in with that. But the reason I bring this story up is, so often we think of conflict itself. We think of the problem that brings out conflict. What we don't stop to consider is the process of conflict. Sometimes what happens is we are so focused when it comes to a conflict on getting a result, of getting to the right place with conflict, that we don't consider how we get there. And let me tell you, I've seen through the years, and I've done this myself, and I've seen other people do it too, where the process of handling conflict is handled wrongly, even if they do get to a good result. Okay? Because sometimes what we do is we manipulate people, right? The process is manipulation, and we might get to the result that we want, but what ends up happening in the long run is because of the poor process of conflict, it ends up causing us more problems as we go down the road. Because I've seen it before, people get manipulated, and so then they might get to a somewhat good result, but then down the road when other conflicts arise, then you've got problems because there is no trust. You don't trust them because of the way that the conflict was handled the first time. And so I want us to think a little bit about this today. You know, on Veterans Day today, I think it's pretty cool, you know, that here we are in church. It was exactly 100 years ago this very hour that the war in Europe ended in World War I. And it's hard to believe, but, you know, World War I, a lot of people don't know this. I'm not going to give you a big, long history question or talk here, as much as I would like to, because I love history. But really, if you look at all the conflicts that's happened here within the 20th century into the 21st century, most of them can be tied back to World War I. You know, we often hear about World War II and how big, you know, it was the deadliest war in all of human history. But World War I was kind of the one that led into all these problems that we even see today. And I kind of was looking around this week because, you know, war, when we talk about war is the, I guess you could say, the most ultimate way of handling a conflict in the wrong way. Even soldiers will tell you that, right? Nobody wants to go to war, okay? But conflict is, or war is kind of the ultimate form of conflict resolution gone wrong, right? I mean, by people dying, that's pretty extreme, right? And when we look at World War II and other wars, what's happened is we saw a result that happened. Thankfully, our country, in partnership with others, ended up with a good result. But I don't think anybody would sit back and say, oh, the way that we got to that result was just wonderful. You know? No, it resulted in the killing of millions of people. You know, back a few years ago, the Canadian Military Journal, what they decided to do is they would look back through history at wars, as much as they were able to research it through historical means. They went all the way back to about 3600 BC, okay? And here's what they found. They found from 3600 BC until present day that there have only been 292 years of peace. Now let's think about that, right? So you've got 3600 years, and then now we've got 2000, so 5600 plus years, right? Out of those 5600 plus years, only 292 of them have had peace. There have been, what they've been able to figure out, there have been 14,531 wars. Now, there's more been added on since this was done. And what they've estimated, listen to this is what really is staggering to me. What they found, what their best estimate is that through all these wars, through all these centuries, okay, 3.6 billion people have died. Think about that. 3.6 billion. I mean, the best estimates that we're hearing today is that there's, around 6 or 7 billion people in the world. So think about that. Through human history, half of the people that's alive today, if they were all to die today, that is how many people have died through war through the centuries. And see, war is the ultimate conflict, and it's the ultimate wrong way, albeit sometimes, as we've seen, you have to, but unfortunately. But war is the ultimate conflict, and it all comes down to how we handle conflict. How do we handle it? What do we do with it? Now, I want to bring that big picture down into the little wars and skirmishes that we have in our own lives, because we have them, right? Now, sometimes it's with an idea, sometimes it's with a person or a group of people, but we have all these wars and all these skirmishes, and what we tend to do is we want to go all out. Let's go all out battle and war with people that we're upset with, that we have conflict with. We go to war with them. Now, you know, we even see through each day, you know, we see it in the news every day that a lot of times it goes to the ultimate where people take each other's life, right? Rather than trying to work through the conflict, they destroy a person's life. Now, we haven't, you know, I'm assuming in here, that none of us have done that, right? But we do it in other ways. And Jesus talks a little bit about that when you look in Matthew chapter 5. He talks a little bit about how we, or excuse me, not 5, Matthew chapter 18, and we're going to get into some of these texts here in a minute, but he talks about how we can kill people, not necessarily physically, but in our hearts. And we do that. We do that. We kill people because we're not concerned about the process of conflict resolution. We are more concerned about the result. And the result is we want to get them. The result is we want them to get the point. And so today I want you to think about, how do you handle the process of conflict in your own life? How well are you doing at that right now? When you have a disagreement with someone, are you really stopping and considering how you handle it in the process and what that looks like? You know, we've looked over these last few weeks. Jesus had a way to handle conflict. Jesus had his own way to handle conflict. And, you know, Jesus wasn't immune to conflict. We've already established that over these few weeks. Jesus he had conflicts with people, but Jesus handled it the right way. And he did that through strategic anger, remembering the mission, showing grace. But we know that we're broken. We know that we're sinners. So trying to resolve conflict is a hard thing for us. But it's something that we have to try to do. If you look in Romans chapter 12, verse 18, the Apostle Paul there, he says, if it's possible, and I want to apologize to you, we had a slight technology issue. One of our screens isn't working this morning, so we tried to angle our screens a little bit here. But in Romans 12:18, it says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. As far as it depends on you, right? You can't make somebody live at peace with you, but we should try the best that we can to do so. And so if that's true then, and if we want to look at Jesus' plan of conflict resolution, let's first look at Matthew chapter 5, okay? In Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 through 25, I'm going to read it, and here's what it says. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, okay, so we have this image of a man who has gone to the temple. He's going to offer up a sacrifice, okay? Now, to get to that point was a pretty big deal, all right? I mean, especially for most people that went to the temple to sacrifice, most of them didn't live in Jerusalem. They came from other areas around the world, and so they would travel all this way, some of them maybe thousands of miles, and then they would go through the process of trying to find an animal to sacrifice. Now, whether they got the animal there locally or they brought it with them, but they went through this huge process, right? They're going all this way for the sacrifice. And so Jesus has this in mind as he's saying, if you were offering your gift at the altar, you know, you're standing in line. It wasn't like you would just walk right up to the altar. Usually there was a very long line in all the holy days. And so you would wait in this line for hours and hours and hours, okay? Kind of like if you're standing in a ride at, you know, Disney World or something. I mean, it's not pleasant, it's not fun, all right? And, you know, you're sitting there in line, and then you're coming up, and you're about to give your gift at the altar, and then Jesus says this. He says, and there, in that moment, you remember that your brother or your sister has something against you. And then in verse 24, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. Okay, so think of it like this. You're getting ready to get on the biggest ride that you've always dreamed of at Disney World. You stood in line for hours, right? And you come right up to the point where you're about to get on, and then all of a sudden, you get out of the line because you got to go to the bathroom, let's say, all right? All right? Then what do? You have to go all the way through the line. That's what Jesus here is saying. He's saying, you're standing in line, and you're waiting to offer the sacrifice. You come up to the altar, and then right as you're about to give this sacrifice, you remember that you have a conflict with someone that's unresolved. And he says, you know what? You need to go and fix that right now. Now, what would most of us do in that moment? Let's be honest, right? We would say, I'll take care of it afterward, right? I mean, what's a few minutes? I'm going to go ahead and get my sacrifice, then I'll go deal with it. So what is Jesus doing here? I mean, what is he trying to do? Well, let's read here, verse 25. He says, settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. In other words, what he's saying is, you need to take care of it now, because if you don't take care of it now, it'll escalate. You know what? He also knew human nature very well. He created us, but he also lived among us, right? And he knew that when we tend to put things off, what happens? It doesn't get done. we ran into this week. My wife and I, we were painting our bedroom. And we painted the main part of our bedroom, and then we have a closet. And when we got done painting the bedroom, we look and realize, our closet has to be painted too, okay? Because we had it was like a light greenish, I don't know, we couldn't figure out what color it was. It was in the house when we moved in. And it was like a greenish, yellowish color. And so we were painting it gray. So, you paint this whole bedroom gray, and then you look and you got this yellow closet, But there's a little bit of a problem with the closet, right? We've got all of our clothes, and then we got a lot of other junk that's in there, okay? And so the temptation is to say what? We'll get it later. We'll deal with it, because it's going to be a lot of work, right? It's a lot of work to get all that stuff out. We'll just do it later. Now, I'm so proud of us because we didn't do that this time. We kept the paint and everything right there in the bedroom, right in front of our sink, so we wouldn't forget, right? But I will say this. Typically, what I like to do is I'll say, I'll get it later. You know what? Jesus knows us, and he knows that when it comes to conflict, because we want to avoid it, which is a natural reaction, right? We don't want to just jump right into conflict. We tend to push it off. We tend to hold off on it. And that's not good, first of all, because the conflict, of course, isn't being resolved. But secondly, when conflict isn't resolved, what does it tend to do? It tends to fester. And when you look there in verse 25, what he's saying is that you need to settle whatever problem that you're having with someone, because it has this tendency to escalate. That's what he's pointing out here. Your adversary hands you over to the judge, and the judge then would hand you over to the officer, and the officer, they throw you. You're being thrown into your own kind of prison because you're allowing it to escalate. Okay? Now, Jesus also talks in another place. If you go into Matthew chapter 18, Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 17, you can probably say that this is the most famous of Jesus' teachings about conflict resolution. We've probably heard this before. But let me say, this teaching that he gives here is probably one of the hardest ones to understand, because it seems a little bit contradictory to some of the other things that he says throughout the Gospels. Let me read it here. It says, if your brother or your sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you, and if they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take them or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And if they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now, let's go back into verse 15. I want to go back because I wanted that to sink in first. If you have a problem with someone, what does he say? You need to go and you need to identify the fault between the two of you. And if they listen to you, great. You've resolved it and you've moved on. Now, you get into verse 16, right? Verse 16, though. But if they won't listen, then what do? You get somebody else involved. You get a mediator or somebody that you both trust involved. All right? Hopefully you can resolve the issue. But then we get into verse 17, and if they still won't listen, what do? You take it to a larger group of people. In this circumstance, Jesus mentions the church. And if they refuse even to listen to the church, and this is where it gets hard. It says at the very end, Jesus says, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Well, that doesn't sound very Jesus-like. Treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. When we talk about conflict, I think something that we have to realize in handling conflict is we have to establish real and meaningful relationship. Too often I've seen people try to work through a conflict, but never really get to know the person that they're in conflict with, right? I mean, that's why countries go to war, because they don't try to understand one another. They're so in their own idea of what they think is right or wrong. And so then what happens is that we tend to make these caricatures of other people that just simply aren't true, but because we don't know them, what happens? We've decided for them who they are. And it gets us into trouble. And see, what Jesus here is trying to say is, you've got to establish relationship with people, but if you've established a relationship, you've tried to work through it, and they get to the place where they will not admit their fault, admit that they're wrong, even in the midst of prevailing evidence by not just a group of a few people, but by a large group of people, then he says to treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. So that when I read that this week, I'm like, gosh, that's just not Jesus-like. But again, this is a perfect example of why when we look at the scripture, and this is what people do, right? They take a scripture and they twist it. We take one verse and we try to make it say something that it just flat out, I'm just going to tell you, in almost every case, doesn't say. We have to look at the Bible in its whole width and its breadth. We have to look at it in its wholeness. And so when I look at this and I see that Jesus says pagan and tax collectors, then I have to stop and think, though, well, wait a minute. We talked about this some time back, right? Zacchaeus was what? He was a tax collector. What did Jesus do? He went to Zacchaeus' house. He established a relationship with him. Pagans. Jesus was around many of them. And yet we know, we can look at different circumstances in the Gospels where he showed love to those who weren't, I mean, they weren't Christians yet per se, but those who didn't believe in God, the God of Israel. So what is Jesus trying to say here? He's trying to say that, you know what, you have to be careful in your relationships with people that won't admit their faults, but that doesn't mean that you don't still love them. See, when he says a pagan or a tax collector, we get this idea that it's almost like the church, if they don't listen to the church, we just kick them out and say, good riddance, you know. That's not at all what he's saying here. He's saying that we have to be careful in that relationship, but we always show love. We always show love. And so when we look at all this, we have to realize is that conflict and how we handle it really matters. You know, even more important than being right or wrong about something, the way that we handle our conflicts often leapfrog into our future interactions with other people. How you handle your conflict will matter later on. And if you handle it well, you will find restoration. And let me tell you, you're going to build a trust and a rapport with another person that's going to help you down the road. Because they know they can trust you, that you're honest, that you're going to try to work through something. But if we don't do that, if we do it poorly, even though you might get to the result that you want, that's not going to be helpful in the future. So here's some things. I'm going to go through. I've got 6 things here I think Jesus teaches us, okay? 6 principles that Jesus gives us from these 2 passages about how we handle conflict matters. Here's the first one. If you have hurt someone, don't wait to deal with it. You know, when it comes to conflict, some of us people are built to resolve conflict quickly. I know one of the things that when I do premarital counseling is we talk about what's called this is a weird word, but an overfunctioner and an underfunctioner. It's a person, an overfunctioner is someone who tries to come in and fix people's problems for them. And then an underfunctioner is someone who doesn't want to handle or fix the problems at all. Okay? When we hear that, most of us fit into one of those. Now, yeah, maybe we got a little bit of both, but most of us are either going to be an over or an underfunctioner. We tend to maybe overdo it or underdo it. But the fact is that no matter what we are, we have to find a way to resolve conflict. And we have to do it relatively quickly. That's what Jesus said, right? You're standing in line, you just remember, I've got this problem with someone, you need to go fix it now. No, don't wait until after you give your sacrifice, or don't wait until, whatever it is that you have going on in your life. No, you need to do it now. You need to be quick about it. Because the longer it festers, the more distrust creeps in, both in you and the other party. So Jesus says if you've hurt someone, don't wait to deal with it. The second thing that he teaches us is he says you need to be clear about the offense. You need to be clear about the offense. You need to know what the problem is. And there in Matthew 18, Jesus talks about it. He says, if you're hurt, show them the fault. Be clear about the offense. Anytime we seek to resolve conflict, we have to be clear about it. It's been interesting to me through the years. I'll have someone come in and talk to me, and they'll say, I've just got this, there's this problem with this person. Sometimes it's a spouse, sometimes it's someone they work with or whatever. And they say, they just drive me crazy, or there's this issue, but they don't get specific. They don't get specific. Like sometimes I'll have a husband come in and say, she just always seems mad at me. And I'm like, okay, well, but why? But in their mind, it's it's not getting down to what the reasoning is for the conflict. It's more about the results of the conflict. They don't want them to be mad, but they don't get down to the reason of why. Sometimes I'll have a person say, well, they just don't seem to trust me. And I'm like, okay, well, why do they not trust you? We have to make sure that we get down to the reason why there is a conflict. Oftentimes we see in a much bigger level in the world, we see conflicts happen between nations. And I'm not 100% sure all the time that there's a clear reason why there's a conflict. It's just maybe past history has caused animosity between the parties or whatever it is. But we don't always know why. And this is important. Because if we don't know why, we can't ever solve it. You know what? If we're going to understand why there's a conflict, again, it comes back to we have to have a relationship. You have to have a relationship with that person that you're in conflict with, as hard as it is. You have to understand why. So that we're not left to creating these caricatures, which we often do, right? Instead, we can stop and understand, okay, this is exactly why. Another thing Jesus teaches us there, and I think this one's an interesting one that he would include this. He says that another principle about this is that you have to keep it private. He says initially when you have a problem with someone, you have to keep it private. But here's the problem. Pride stands in the way. And so when we have a problem with someone, especially when it's in a public type of setting, what do we tend to do? We got to protect our pride. So rather than trying to resolve the conflict privately, we start going around and telling everybody about it. You know what? This is where social media, right, creates so many difficulties. I was talking with somebody this week about this, just about how difficult it is today to, I think, in many ways resolve conflict, because sometimes what happens is we put it out there on Facebook for all the world to see. And then what happens is that the party that you're in conflict with then feels like they have to defend themselves, right? Now, maybe they won't do it on Facebook, but they might do it in some other way. And it's hard to find a way to resolve the conflict. I don't talk a whole ton about this, but I do probably feel like I need to talk about it more. And I know some of you in here don't do the whole social media thing, so just hang with me for a minute, all right? But social media is something that I think we have to be extremely careful with. And really, in many ways, I think social media is more dangerous when it comes to communication and interpersonal relationships than we've ever had. Because it's so much easier for us to say and do things on social media that before you just couldn't really do. You know, before, if I was upset with someone, yeah, I might tell a few people around me. Well, now, if I have 1,000 friends on Facebook, everybody knows like that. And so then now what's happened is I've created conflict with 1,000 people like that. I tell you, there are some days I go on social media, I'm like, why do I even do this? You know, I do think that there are positive things behind social media. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's all bad. I think it's brought connectivity to some people that maybe we wouldn't have connected with. I think that's a good thing. But one of the problems, though, is we get into this idea that when we have conflict, that we need to just put it out there for all to see. That's not, if Jesus had a Facebook page, all right, he wouldn't be doing that, okay? He wouldn't say, well, I can't believe what those Sadducees did to me in the temple today, so I'm going to go on Facebook and tell the world about it, you know? That's not what he did, okay? It's not what he would do. We have to handle these matters privately. Now, are there places and times for it to become more publicly? Absolutely, and Jesus gives us that. He shows us that. Here's the other thing. Fourth principle. Be fair. Be fair when it comes to your conflict resolution. You know, between the two of you, you need to be fair and seek compromise when it's possible. And if that doesn't work, then find someone to be that intermediary that will be fair. You know, it's interesting to me today that we have such a hard time finding people to be fair intermediaries that we actually have to go out and hire them. This happens a lot in divorce proceedings where people just cannot try to work through it. So what do? The court appoints some kind of an intermediary because it's hard to find someone to be fair. I think that's a problem. Sometimes that happens in the church. We have problems with one another, right? Rather than trying to find that middle person, we just don't. We have to find an intermediary that will be fair. We need to look for someone, if we can't resolve it between just the two of us, find that person who is fair, who is godly, who is wise, who loves God and cares for both of you. You know, in John chapter 8, verse 17, it says this, in your law it is written that the testimony of two witnesses is true. What Jesus there is pretty much trying to say is he's saying that we need to find other people to get involved that are going to be honest and who are witnesses, who aren't the type that go and make up stories, but are people that see things for what they are, for how real they are. We have to do a better job at that. Our nation has to do a better job at that. Our families, our community, we have to do a better job at that. The fifth thing that Jesus gives us here in this is that we need to pray about it. I will stand up here guilty as charged. There's been times I've had conflict and I didn't pray about it. Because I thought I could figure it out, right? Or I was so upset and angry about it that I would rather not, I don't want to pray about it. You ever been like that before? I don't want to pray about it because I want to be mad. We have to stop and pray about it. You know, I found through the years it's really hard to be mad at someone you're praying for. And Jesus, we know he's smart, but man, he's so smart here, right? Pray about it. Pray for people. We need to pray for the conflicts that we're involved in. We need to encourage other people, not in a gossiping or slander way, but in a truly honest way, to invite other people to pray with you for the conflict. You know, when I look at this passage that I shared about there in Matthew 18, that very last one there in verse 17, Matthew 18, 17, for so many years, I looked at that negatively. It was like, okay, if they don't listen to you, and they don't listen to a group of people, and they don't listen to the church as a whole, then just kick them out. That was the negative view that I had for so many years. You know what? The reason why Jesus encouraged these people, these hypothetical people, right, to come to the church, is because the church, we as the church, should be the place where people can find resolution. And where people can find that transformation, that we can all be, that we can all be kind of fixed together. So often that's not the case, unfortunately. But that is what should happen. Our place in the church is to reconcile parties who are in disagreement with one another and to love them both. We need to pray more about our conflicts together. You know, sometimes we get prayer cards. And we don't always put everything. I know many of you get a prayer and praise report that we send out. But we don't always put these because they're often more confidential. But there's people that have conflict in our church and they write these cards and we pray together. That's what the church should be about. So we're praying together for these conflicts that are going on in our lives. You know, there's a little boy who was bad at church. And he was making all kinds of noise, just wasn't sitting down and doing what he should. And so his dad, finally just got to the place where he couldn't take it anymore. So he picked up the little boy and starts going out. You know, we've probably all been there, right? You're in a public place. If you've had children, you're like, oh man, this is not good. This is kind of embarrassing, right? And so you're walking out. And so, but nobody in the church really paid attention. Kids are kids. And so as he's going out the door, though, nobody was paying attention. But as he's going out the door, this little boy, he just screams out, he's crying, ah! And then he yells back into the church. He goes, y'all pray for me. Pray for me, Pray for me. He was asking for prayer in his conflict, all right? But, maybe we should be doing the same thing. We should be asking for other people to pray for us when we're in the midst of our conflict. So pray about it. Sixth principle is this one. Don't give up. Don't give up. When things don't work out right, when they don't work out right away, it's easy to give up on a situation. Jesus didn't say to treat them as a pagan or a tax collector, to just get rid of them and forget about them. What he was saying is, yes, they may be far from you, but don't give up on them because they're loved by God.
I don't know, in your family and your friendships and your relationships, maybe there's someone that over the past years has gotten far from you. You can't give up on that situation. As frustrating as it is. I know I've got some things in my own life that I've seen that happen. And it's hard, and you're waiting, and it's hard, but we have to be people that aren't willing to give up. We have to keep going. We have to keep trying. And so when you hear these principles today, I want to challenge you with this as we wrap this series up, is does getting what you want matter more than how you got it? When it comes to conflict, does getting the result matter to you more than how you get there? And really, both things should matter. We should care, yes, about getting to a good place with someone, but we should care about how we get there. How are you doing with that? You know, I would say this. I think a lot of us, what tends to happen is we get to a good result because we just kind of let it slide by. You know, we have a problem with someone, we just kind of let time take care of it or whatever, and then, you know, but it's never really dealt with. Let me tell you today, that's not a good way to handle it. It's not going to bring you to a good result in the end. We have to be willing to confront it. We have to be willing to do something with it. So, well, how are you doing there? Are you doing some of these things that we've talked about today? Because the fact is that the way that we handle conflict affects our future conflict. We're either going to get better at handling conflict or we're going to get worse at it. And so we have to look at some of these principles we've looked at over these last few weeks, and we have to start trying to find ways to interject them into our conflicts. And we have to grow at it. You know, the first time that you kind of change things, it might not go smoothly, but you have to start somewhere. And then as you do that more and more, it gets better, I promise you. But we have to change some of the way that we approach our conflicts. You know, in many ways, the big secret and the great wisdom behind what Jesus teaches us is that the way we handle conflict now affects the next one. I mean, if we handle conflict with timeliness, if we're clear about what the problem is, we keep it between ourselves, that we're fair, we're filled with prayer, and we persist to a resolution. If we do those things, then the next conflict that comes will be easier. Because we'll have a roadmap in place. We'll have a better approach in place. You know what? We as the church, we can go a long way to bridging some of this conflict that's happening within our community, because it's here. It's in every community. We can be a part of the solution here if we would live by these principles that we see Jesus sharing with us here. You know, Jesus was what we would say, he was the ultimate conflict resolutioner, right? Because he came to this world, he died on the cross for our sin to resolve the conflict between us and God. You know what he came, the scripture tells us that he came at what? Just the right time. He was timely in his conflict resolution. He was definitely clear about what the problem is, right? That's our sin. And he went and he was. You know what? You could say in many ways that what he did on the cross was a very private affair because it was a transaction between him and God and us, right? As he took our sin. Jesus is always fair. And his fairness is what really led him to the cross, because fairness, he deserved judgment and death, right? But instead what he did was he took the punishment for us. You know, there's so many ways that Jesus has resolved the greatest of our conflict. And so today, if you haven't resolved that conflict, that's the first one you need to take care of, is the conflict between yourself and God. Jesus is the one who can do that for you. He has done that for you. So today I want to invite you to do that. But for all of us today, we have conflicts. Let's look to Jesus. Let's look to him as the one who can help us solve these conflicts and to find peace in our relationships. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be worth it, I promise you. Okay, let's pray. God, we thank you for your teaching to us over these last few weeks about handling conflict. God, it's hard because our world is just surrounded in conflict. I mean, we see it in a big way between nations and people groups, but then we also see it in our families and in our workplaces and in our school classrooms. And God, there's just conflict all around, and you don't want that for us. I mean, this world wasn't supposed to be this way. We know that. This world, sin has just radically transformed the way this world operates. And God, you don't want it to be that way, but it is. And you're a realist. You understand the problem that's going on around us. And so, God, you've given us all these principles of ways that we can help resolve this conflict. And God, so often we want to say that we wait for the other person to make the move. God, we have to be the person to step out and to resolve it. We have to step out and look for ways to be able to solve the conflicts that we run into. God, give us boldness and courage to do that. And God, I thank you for your Son, who took care of the greatest conflict of all, who gave his life for us. Father, I thank you for your love. Thank you for your grace. God, I thank you for wanting our relationships to be mended and healed. God, you are a good Father. You want what's best for us. And so, God, help us to accept this teaching so that we can have what's best for us.